All right, so I was saying why gender responsive procurement is important. Now, the World Bank actually describes gender responsive procurement as a solution multiplier. And this is because the point of gender responsive procurement is, to empower women's economic empowerment, and to reduce, to reduce gender inequalities, because gender inequality is correlated with a lot of societal problems: child poverty, child health, domestic economic competitiveness. So countries that are more gender equal actually have better economies. They're more competitive. Of course, gender-based violence and sexual violence against women is correlated with gender inequality. A lot of women face economic discrimination. Of course, women who are in formal employment face a gender pay gap and all that. In South Africa, women are 51% of the population, as they are in many other countries. But in South Africa, only obtain between 3 and 6% of public contracts and about 1% of public contracts globally. So the figures are dismal, especially when you consider, like in South Africa, women own about close to 40% of the small businesses. So the disparity between the public contracts that women access and their participation in entrepreneurship is really huge. And that's one of the things that gender responsive procurement is trying to address. Is like, how do we ensure that we integrate women into public sector supply chains? So what does that have to do with innovation? I already said that innovating talks about products and processes. We have to innovate our procurement processes to be more inclusive, to include women-owned businesses, to ensure that we design public services in a way that considers its impact on gender. So we can also innovate our goods when we have more suppliers being from diverse backgrounds, when we have more suppliers who are, have a gender lens, who are women-owned businesses, and can provide services that considers the impact of those services on women. So in South Africa, we've got, our preferential procurement regulations were changed last year because of some legal issues. And so organs of states are no longer mandated to follow a very prescribed framework for social criteria in procurement. So they can do it, but the rules have changed. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I just want to talk a little bit about gender procurement in South Africa. Where are we right now? So in terms of our social procurement, the focus has always been on awarding contracts to the target groups. And those target groups are really Black-owned companies, which is why we have the Black Economic Empowerment Framework and everything that goes on with that. And of course, women are included in the Black Economic Empowerment Framework, but it's Black women. And so what happens is that you have women described only in terms of race, but are competing with Black men, Black youth, Black township dwellers in our Black Economic Empowerment Framework. So women are not prioritized in that sense. But nothing in our procurement framework addresses the impact or the design of public services and the impact that can have on women. And in the water, health, and sanitation environment, that can actually be life-threatening for women. And now, because of obviously apartheid spatial planning, there was no pipe-borne water to township areas. And now municipal governments and provincial governments are trying to catch up and provide those sanitation services, but this is not being done with a gender lens, which means that these public toilets now in the townships are being provided without thinking of the impact that they have on women. And so that has a number of problems, and I'll show you what that means. So we have, so this is Khayelitsha. I think if you're in South Africa, you know what Khayelitsha means. One of the largest townships we have, I think over 1 million people in population. And you can see that if you live close to where those chemical toilets, the blue toilets, are being provided, there's no problem. But if you live at the other end and you have to access these services, you're going there at night, the streets or the pathways are not lit. What this means is that in Khayelitsha, research has shown that there's 635 rapes that are attributed to women trying to access the toilets at different times of the day. So there's violence, assault, there's murder. And because women are afraid to access these toilets, many of them don't. And then they use a bucket in their homes, which obviously is problematic because then that creates health issues, typhoid, cholera, etc., etc. So another problem with these toilets is many of them are not lit within. And the thing is that women access public toilets very differently from men. Women are primary caretakers, which means that you're taking children to the toilet, you're taking the elderly, you're taking the disabled. Can any woman raise her hand and say, I can take and change my child in this toilet? Just show of hands. This toilet is fine for accessing with someone else. Impossible, right? Even for yourself, accessing the toilet is a problem. Talk less of trying to access it on behalf of someone else. So we haven't designed these toilets thinking about who the users actually are. 10 years ago, South Africa had this very brilliant toilet design. This is an innovation, obviously, because nobody has ever designed a toilet in this manner. And we had the toilet was, because again, this is a toilet being designed. I don't know who the user could have been, but I can only describe it as an innovation because there's no other word for it. But again, you think about this is not being designed with thinking about who the users are supposed to be because it's not usable. So it's like when we write specifications, whether for products, whether from a functional lens, are we thinking about who is using those services? So again, we've talked about our public procurement bill, so I won't dwell too much on that. And we know that the public procurement bill still has social issues in mind, and it says the people that could be preferred include women. So legally, we have a responsibility to ensure that we're prioritizing women in public procurement. And some of the measures that the procurement bill says we can use to implement preferences are set aside, subcontracting, and different things, transformation, etc., etc. So, but in all this, we still don't have anything in our law that talks about ensuring that the design and the delivery of public services does not adversely impact women. So what does the law allow us to do? So set aside. In 2020, President Cyril Ramaphosa, on the occasion of Women's Day, said that we have to reserve up to 40% of public contracts for women. We're in 2023, we're at the end of 2023, nothing has been done on that. The current law says that we can subcontract as a bid condition for these target groups. These target groups include women. How are we going to do that? What is going to be the threshold? So how are we going to do this to ensure that we actually prefer and prioritize women in some form within our procurement regulation? So I'm throwing the gauntlet to Estelle and the team from Treasury. The president has said you should do this, and I know you don't want to disappoint him. So, we have to think about, as we draft those regulations for the bill, we have to think about what can we really do within the boundaries of the law to think about addressing this issue. In South Africa, one of the things I didn't say is that 42% of children under the age of 18 are raised by female-headed households. So again, if you're thinking about some of the problems we have in society, empowering women economically, integrating women into public sector supply chains can address some of those issues. So the last point I want to make is, how do we think about the design of public services in a way that would work for women? And one of the ways that we can do this, and I think one of the speakers has talked about this, is integrating communities into the design of these services. So there was a project done on public services on community-based procurement in India, and they found that out of 84 projects, there was better value for money for projects where the community was involved. So community was involved in designing or drafting the specifications. Obviously, community was involved in specifying what their needs were. Communities were involved even in the actual implementation of the procurement. So they used community-based contractors. And this meant that there were cost savings. There was a strong sense of ownership of those products because the communities, felt that sense of ownership. So they used them. And there was near universal usage of those facilities, which is what you want. So these projects rated very highly in terms of, their needs, planning, scheduling, and all that. but they scored very poorly in terms of market research because the contracts were actually implemented by the community themselves. So we have to think about how we can deliver successful outcomes, even if we're not using conventional procedures. And we've talked, I think yesterday we talked about relationship-based procurement, where communities can establish a mutually beneficial and accountable relationship between the purchaser and the supplier. So my final point is that we need to think about using our current legal options to include women-owned businesses in contract awards. We need to, as a public sector, upgrade our process so that it becomes more inclusive, upgrade our process so that we consider the obstacles to women participating in public procurement. And I've done a whole raft of research on some of those obstacles in South Africa and in other African countries. Think about how we draft our bid specifications so that we consider the design of our public services on women, and upgrade public goods and services provided to women so that they work for women. As Songezo said, there should be nothing about women without women. Thank you.
Well done. That was all 26 minutes, including a 10-minute break, so very well done, Prof. I'm especially more empowered now to be even more enthusiastic in curtailing people's time if they do not indeed honor it. In Buwane, about a decade ago, just to address the question of the value of the community engagement, they burnt down 23 schools because the protest was, we don't want to be in this municipality. You remember that? 23 schools were burnt down because there was a protest that had nothing to do with schools. Now, can you imagine if that community had built those schools, how they would have responded to that question of wanting to either be in this administration or that administration? Thanks, Prof, for highlighting the importance thereof. Let's welcome, please, ladies and gentlemen, the Chief Legal Officer of the Kenya Electricity Generating Company, PLC, from Kenya, Mr. Ibrahim Kitu. Mr. Kitu, I think it's going to be easier for me to come here after 18 minutes if you're still standing, because everybody else has been somewhat deferent to this very charming MC.
Just connect this. Okay, one thing he did is that he left before I connected my gadget. So I'll want you to be around so that I can be sure that everything is, it's already there. It picks automatically. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And of course, good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Kenya, and greetings from Kenya in the context of electricity generation, not distribution, not transmission. So my name is Ibrahim Kito. Like he said, I'm the Chief Legal Officer in charge of projects and disputes resolution with the Kenya Electricity Generating Company, PLC. This is a listed state corporation in Kenya, commanding 80% of the power which is supplied to the grid. And of course, a beautiful thing to talk about is that 80% of the power is also renewable, so it's clean. So Kenya, we are consuming at least 80% of the power is clean power, renewable energy. So just to take us through the whole presentation, I've had a privilege of being able to present the green one. Yeah, being able to present after Professor Shope has presented. She's one of the people I'm always admiring on the background in terms of public procurement law. And of course, Professor Eunice, I don't know whether I'm mentioning the name quite well. Also somebody I'm really admiring in terms of understanding public procurement law because it's close to my heart. And of course, because that's basically what I do, delivering strategic projects for the company. And of course, with that, that means that you have to do a lot of procurement. Just to take us through, The first thing I want to take you through is I was struggling to understand whether what I'm going to take you through is really innovation or it's creativity or whichever name to give it. So if my presentation does disappoint you, if it doesn't come out like what I'm taking you through is innovation, please forgive me for that, because I think you've seen ourselves all struggling to see how innovation can sit in procurement, especially because of the rule-based approach. You must have seen some infrastructure there. That is our standard gauge railway, which is fully functional. It's celebrating its 1 year from the time it was delivered, not on conventional procurement, but on public-private partnerships approach. But speaking to innovation, I will take you through the legal foundations of public procurement law without boring you, because some of these things are quite basic. So of course, we have a constitution of Kenya, which is for 2010. And of course, that Article 227(1) forms the basis of any public procurement and even a regime in Kenya, be it conventional procurement or be it public-private partnerships. One thing South Africa should be proud of is that Kenyan constitution borrows heavily from the South African constitution, even in terms of the legal underpinnings of public procurement. So this particular provision you see is actually a replica of the South African constitution. So something to be proud of as South Africans. Then of course, it also speaks about the public procurement principles. And then of course, we'll be looking at the principal law which governs public procurement in Kenya, which is the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act for 2015. This is actually not the first law. We had the first law, which was repealed, of course, to align it with the times and especially to align it with the constitution. So we'll also be looking at that. We'll be keen to look at, I think I tried to mention something to do with innovation, and I think Prof has actually done me justice by trying to define what is innovation, and therefore I'll not want to bore you a lot. But one thing I'll want to mention is that there is an aspect of novelty and originality in when you talk about innovation. So to that extent, I think you can see why we are struggling, whether we are talking about creativity, whether it's innovation, or whether it's value addition in procurement. Why innovation? And the first thing is that innovation is actually one of the tenets under SDG 9. I don't know how many of us know that innovation is actually captured under SDG 9, which includes industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Therefore, innovation, if not for anything, is something key because it allows us to be able to have benefit of realizing SDG 9. Then, of course, innovation remains a policy imperative for any state to be able to grow and, of course, thrive, and, of course, remain a going concern. Public procurement, I think, innovation is actually not routine. It's not the normal thing you just want to do every time, you know, our normal processes in procurement. It is something more, and therefore it means then that you need to do a little bit more for you to talk about innovation in public procurement. So I'll be able to take you through the various approaches Kenya as a country has been able to realize innovation, or what we can call innovative strategies in public procurement in Kenya. And the first one, which we find groundbreaking, was actually the introduction of e-procurement, and also mainstreaming e-procurement into our procurement system regime. So the starting point was that the law had to be enabling. So you find that our public procurement law and practice has actually been able to really make meaning in terms of e-procurement. It is not only in law, it is being facilitated in terms of infrastructure, and of course, beyond that, in terms of practice, it has become the norm. So one of the things you will actually realize is that in Kenya, we actually have an authority called the ICT Authority, and it was actually set up to be able to facilitate state public entities in terms of meeting the ICT demands, and of course, being able to spur ICT and mainstream ICT in the public sector. We also have what we call MyGov, which means it's a public tender portal. For example, every Tuesday, all state entities, public entities are expected to upload all the tenders, the intent, to have the public participate in that particular portal. It's also a newspaper which is circulated free, and it's available for any entrepreneur, anybody who wants to do business with the government. So in terms of transparency, accountability, and of course, being able to leverage on technology, this MyGov has actually come in hand in terms of assisting the government in terms of informing the citizens about the available business opportunities. Of course, there's also an initiative we call Buy Kenya, Build Kenya strategy, which was actually a ministerial strategy, 2017, and it came in handy at the time. The government was also very keen in terms of mainstreaming ICT in the public sector. So through this particular strategy, what was happening is that the president gave a directive that at least, if not for anything, for the purpose of patriotism, Kenyans must support local products by at least making sure that everything utilized, at least 40%, let it be manufactured or even be sold by the local entrepreneurs. So it was from the aspect of, to meet the aspect of being able to talk about loyalty to your products, and of course to spur the economic growth, and of course the manufacturing sector in the country. So it was also, in terms of the ability to be able to have it work, it also had what we call a reward mechanism, that those state corporations, those public entities, which were able to demonstrate that actually that they were able to utilize and they were able to meet the 40% of public procurement budget by supporting the Buy Kenya, Build Kenya strategy, 2017, were actually being measured, and it became a key performance indicator for any state institution, so that when you are annually being evaluated and you're able to demonstrate this, then there are marks awarded to you to this. So from the carrot approach. So it was also incorporated the performance contracting services for all the government entities. Let's talk about, I think we spoke about e-procurement. Yeah, local content. And when you talk about local content, it's also one of the strategies. And one of the things I can confirm is local content is actually very key in Kenya. It has been mainstreamed in the procurement practice, and you'll actually find it integrated into all the public procurement systems, tenders, and of course, in terms of contracts. So you'll find several local content provisions and requirements in international tenders. And actually, a very critical thing is that it is actually a mandatory requirement which forms a preliminary evaluation criteria specifying that successful bidders shall transfer technology skills and knowledge through training, mentoring, and participation of Kenyan citizens. And of course, in terms of the workforce, 75% of the workforce opportunities should be reserved for Kenyans, and not only for the workforce at the low cadre, 20% in the senior management is actually expected to be reserved for Kenyans. In terms of implementation, that is still a challenge, and this is actually meant especially for these high, huge value infrastructure projects. There's also a requirement for the local content plan for technology transfer and 40% reservation for local supplies. And for these, we are speaking about the projects which are actually of high value, maybe speaking to projects in the road sector, energy sector, projects at the aviation space, and the sorts. And of course, the whole essence is to ensure then that at least some sort of income remains in the country, even as we engage external international contractors. So one thing to mention about, to talk also about, is the aspect of the 30%, which I think is actually a requirement. If you're a foreign contractor, then it's expected that as you bid, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've entered into a specific arrangements with the local contractor, and that at least 30% of the contract value is going to remain within the country. Let's talk about local content in the context of the insurance sector. So one of the things in the insurance sector is that for you to be able to offer insurance, and especially for these high value projects, then you must be, you must be registered by the local insurance regulatory authority. Otherwise, if you don't, then you cannot be able to qualify to be able to deliver on that particular product. I'll want to speak about the local content in terms of also the shareholding, that if you're local for those high value contracts, and in cases whereby the kind of goods which are being supplied it can be demonstrated that they are locally available, then what is expected is that if you're talking about a value of a project for 500 million Kenya shillings, you can translate that into dollar or rand, then anything below 500 million Kenya shilling is actually purely reserved for the local citizens. That means the foreign contractors can only be able to participate in projects for value of above 500 million Kenya shillings. Of course, the threshold is 51%. That if it's 51% shareholding, then of course you are classified as a foreign contractor. I think I'll not speak so much about the aspect of reservations and preferences, because I think Professor Shope spoke about it. But one of the things you'll notice that Kenya is also very key and very keen in terms of preferences. And of course, we also do take care of the kind of things Professor Shope was talking about in terms of taking care of people with disabilities, micro, small, and medium enterprises, work, services, and goods, or any combination. We also are very keen in terms of offering procurement in terms of regions. So we kind of do lotting for regions, so that if you are doing a particular project in a particular region and you can clearly demonstrate that those services or goods are available, then you are limited, or you are encouraged to ensure then that you give opportunities to those people. I think he spoke about the 30% threshold. I think I've spoken about it. Something very unique in evaluation is that if a tender is both open to international and local, then when you are doing an evaluation in terms of pricing, for those bidders who are able to make it to the pricing, if you have a foreign contractor and a local one, then the local contractor is able to get a benefit in terms of pricing, in that the pricing for the local contractor is actually given a preference of 20%. For example, if we are talking about a contract price of 100 million, if a local one has actually bidded at 100 million, then that particular bid price or tender price is actually subjected to 20%. It's treated as 20% less. That means your bid is taken to be 80%, and therefore, in comparison with the foreign contractors, you are given an advantage by giving you that kind of preference in terms of the pricing. But in terms of the award, you are actually given the award at the contract price. I think we'll talk about specially permitted procurement procedures. We spoke about procurement methods. Kenya has utilized several innovative procurement methods. And I think if you get time and go through the presentation, you should be able to learn more about specially permitted procurement procedures, which as a company, we have actually utilized it. And then, of course, it has conditions for use, approval by Treasury, and of course, exceptional circumstances. We'll also be looking at two-stage tendering. When you are talking about functional procurement, in Kenya, this takes care of it. It allows you to ask not for the product, but for the functional guarantees you want. So what you do is that at the first phase, the first stage is that you're able to speak to your problem, because you actually understand the problem, but you don't have a solution in terms of clear specifications. So what you do is that you invite the bidders, and then in the first instance, they submit one envelope, and it speaks to their ability to understand the problem, and they give you a solution. Immediately after that, then the ones you identify to have been able to grasp your problem, then you invite them to submit their financial bids. So that is a very unique procurement method, which we found working for us in terms of being able to meet functionalities. Community participation method, quite rampant in Kenya right now, especially when dealing with strategic projects and when you want to secure what we call a social license to operate. Yeah, then we also utilize processes like unbundling. We also do lotting. We also do things to call subcontracting and the sort. I think we already discussed about this in terms of what you need to do to achieve innovation, so I will not want to dwell much on that. Asanteni sana.
Asante sana, rafiki yangu. Did I say that right?
Yes, you
Thank
got
you very
it
much.
right.
Please stay on stage.
Thank you.
Asante sana, rafiki yangu. Just in case you're wondering how multilingual I am, be careful of what you say in my presence. Don't have to tell you I'm a Stellenbosch student, so I can certainly speak Afrikaans, and I'm very comfortable in that language. Come from the Eastern Cape, I'm very conversant in isiXhosa. I'll stop right there in case I give away a bit of my secrets. May I please call on stage Professors Eukins and Williams while I take 3 questions. Anybody want to ask a question of Mr. Ibrahim Kitu? You confirm that, and that's the only question he will field, please, because we are running out of time. 1 for Professor Eukins and 1 for Professor Williams. Yeah, I beg your pardon. I saw 1. Question 4? Question 4?
Yes,
Ma'am, the question is for?
it's for the last presenter. Sir.
Oh, Professor Kitu. Okay, so who has a question then for Professor Williams? A question for Professor Williams. A question for Professor Eukins.
I got one. I have one.
What on earth was that? I got such a fright. Eukins A, Eukins B.
I want to be, you can see.
Prof, please. Yeah, Prof, here, yeah, you exposed me here because now I'm forced to go the A and B routes. So, okay. Question for Mr. Kitu, question for Professor Williams, questions A and B for Eukins. Thanks, yeah. Question 1.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to the presenters. Fortunately, I'm the first person. My question is a generic question, so each and every presenter will have to respond as they respond to other questions. It's about the drive that we have this year as Africans to ensure that we accelerate the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement in terms of everything that we do. The question to my brother from Kenya is, how have they infused that requirement in the procurement? I've heard him about local content, and I'm asking this so that when South Africa presents, they must respond to it. How have we ensured that in our processes, whether it's novelty or innovation, which is a different debate, we make sure that we maximize the acceleration of Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, especially when it regards to the protocol on trade in goods, which has the rules of origin. And the same applies to my colleague, Prof, in terms of how is the same being propagated in protection of women so that we can move faster. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 2.
Thank you, Chair. Mine is a little bit controversial, hence I have to.
We like that. Go for it.
Okay. Prof, you spoke about, Prof. Soper, you spoke about gender equality and also gender responsive procurement. So growing up, I was told that there are only 2 genders, male and female. So I want to understand gender responsive procurement from LGBTQIA community. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. 3A.
Prof. Eukins, the protection of intellectual property rights, what happens when it expires? You know, and the owner doesn't renew it in the state contract. You know, is then that forfeited to the state, or and also how do we deal with the renewal of? How do you deal with innovation in the process of ownership? All right. I can sneak one, just one. On my Kenyan brother, the insurance one, the local content. How do you deal with the WTO trade-related investment measures, which requires that you cannot extend it to the private sector. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks also for Prof. Euken's, specifically on competitive dialogue. I was just interested in how, because the transaction costs are quite high and the timelines are quite long, interested in how you manage that, especially with the smaller innovators or suppliers, and just, I suppose, to kind of equalize the playing field for those actors, and whether there are subsidies in any of that process for their costs. Thanks.
Okay, all right. So I'll start. Okay, so first, in terms of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, it excludes public procurement. So public procurement markets are not open in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. You have regional procurement markets being open in COMESA, in the West African Economic and Monetary Union, and in the East African Community, where you can have bidders from within those regions bidding for public contracts in other countries. But in terms of the AFTA itself, it doesn't have a procurement protocol. So the trade in goods is private sector business, business to business. It's not business to government, right? So for now, procurement is excluded from ACTA. Maybe in subsequent revisions, procurement might be included. But of course, because we know from what Mr. Kito has said and from South Africa, procurement is very protectionist. So those markets are not open. So that's that. So maybe that will change. In terms of gender responsive procurement and LGBTQ, so in terms of that, what I always say is that if you have reservations for women, then if you are identifying as a woman and you meet the threshold for whatever that is, then then those contracts will be open to you, right? It's only people who don't identify with any gender that will then struggle to partake of contracts reserved for women, but possibly they would have to choose one gender for that purpose. But LGBTQ don't necessarily mean they don't have a gender. If you're talking about lesbians and gays, they usually do. It's only people who are transgender that are or people who are gender fluid and I don't think that they are enough for the rules not to apply, right? Because they're not in the majority. But you would have to, most people identify with a gender, even if it's not their biological gender. So I don't think that that's enough of an issue that would compromise the applicability of rules. You would choose one, and if you meet those thresholds, then you apply. Then you would apply. So that's how I would address that.
Okay. I'll try to address it's just to add to what Prof has actually said. So one of the things you realize is that the African countries, and we have to be honest with each other, is that we are looking for growth. We want to grow our economy. So that explains the reason as to why we need to have some of these mechanisms. They may actually look like they are protectionist mechanisms, of course, compared with what one would want to have in terms of having a liberalized economy in terms of procurement. But then I think it is good to appreciate where we are and also appreciate that to grow our economies from where they are to where they need to be, then of course that approach is important. Maybe the question will be, do we still tick the box in terms of the capabilities and also in terms of the ability to be able to finance, for example, some of the projects which may be high value projects. So that is where the discussion is. But like I was saying, in Kenya, in terms of being able to also facilitate liberalization, is that we say that we are open to business, but then when we do tenders which allow international competition, we say, look, we are ready to give you this tender, but at least there are some conditions you need to meet so that we can also have a part of the pie to grow our economy. And that is why we have measures like technology transfer expectations, even when the tender is being developed, skills transfer, local content plan in terms of how you need to implement local content, and the serious monitoring of some of these stipulations. In fact, in most cases, they come as form of undertakings and warranties in the tender and even the contract, so that if you breach them, and I'm actually enforcing that high value contract, then I can hold you to account. I can even terminate the contract or even put sanctions because you are not delivering the contract as per the undertakings. So I think the missing link perhaps will be the monitoring aspect. But then there are also these other mechanisms I think I spoke about, whereby you can actually identify a project, realize that it's a high value project, it is significant in terms of the revenues, and then you say, it's not everything in this project which is complex. We can be able to break it down. That is what we call unbundling, but still ensuring then that you don't do what we call tender split, and then you're able to maybe distribute the opportunities to so many people, either within the country or even outside. So unbundling is real in Kenya, and it has been able to add a lot of value in terms of also mainstreaming local content and ensuring that something remains locally, even as most of the contract price goes outside the country, especially in cases whereby we don't have capacity. Try to address the aspect of the insurance. Yes, I'll say that in Kenya, the aspect of insurance and banking is also becoming controlled, in that if you want to deliver insurance for some of these projects, strategic projects, then the only reason you'll be allowed to actually have an insurance provider outside the country is where you can be able to clearly demonstrate that the capabilities within the country do not exist. And then, like I said, one of the requirements is that you must be registered. The insurance service provider must be registered with the local insurance regulatory authority. Of course, for obvious reasons, for enforcement in terms of breaches of, if you want to enforce maybe the performances or guarantees given in insurance. And of course, the other thing is also the local content aspect. But then one of the things I need to mention is that it is not a total bar for foreign participants in the insurance sector. In cases whereby you're able to demonstrate that capabilities don't exist locally, then there's an exception allowed. The only thing is that now the foreign insurance company to provide this is allowed to register with the local insurance regulatory authority, so that then the authority is aware of all these scenarios. Of course, the other thing is to also allow joint venture arrangements with the local insurance companies, subcontracting as well. Thank you.
Okay, just to follow up quickly on what Chopé was talking about, the free trade agreement. So history is behind Chopé's position. Right after the war in 45, 46, the initial planning documents for the World Trade Organization called for government procurement to be included in the free trade agreements, what became the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It took about 50 years for the government procurement agreement to come into full fruition. So Chopé said maybe a few years, it could be 50 years before the government markets are open. The European lesson is that if you're really going to integrate an economy, because GDP, so much of the GDP is in procurement, you have to include procurement. In Ghana, for example, roughly 40% of the GDP is in public procurement. If you're going to integrate Ghana with the rest of Africa, for example, you have to open up the public procurement markets as well. It just, because of the political reasons, shortly after the war, the European great powers, the victors, resisted it for exactly the reasons that you've identified today, but that tends to wear down over time. On the question of the IP, sir, there's a mechanical answer to your question. The IP is dealt with, intellectual property is dealt with in 3 separate categories. No government funding, some government funding, all government funding for the new technology. And usually things fall in the middle where there's some government funding. In that case, the contractor, the vendor, has to demonstrate why the government should not grab all the rights. And it does that by specifying what it has developed independently. In that negotiation, if the government says, no, we're going to take all the rights, the vendor says, well, that's great, but we're going to stop innovating over the course of the contract because we're not going to get any rights. And that back and forth allows a window, a pathway for innovation, even where the government is taking, and it's a license right. The government isn't actually owning the patent, they're taking a license right. On the second question of competitive dialogue, it's actually something we were talking about yesterday with regards to the proposed regulations. The South African proposed statute refers to transversal contracts, which we studied them during the pandemic. We thought that meant framework. We were stupid. We didn't realize that meant transversal means between agencies. But essentially, South Africa already has framework agreements in the transversal contracts. Once you have transversal or framework agreements set up with small businesses, then the second stage competitive dialogue, which is what we do, about 20% of that 60% that we have in the United States are in fact second stage competitions under existing framework agreements. It reduces the transaction costs enormously. And I just close out quickly on Sageza. I'm going to ask my own question. Professor Eukens, what's the one change you would make to the South African law, or what's the one thing you would put in the South African regulations in order to advance gender-based procurement? Compliance. There's nothing in there about compliance. And compliance, forcing contractors to set up internal compliance systems is really important. It has a multiplier effect. So for example, to deal with gender-based violence around World Bank projects, primarily here in Africa, the World Bank requires contractors to set up, on the affected projects, set up compliance systems to stop gender-based violence. If there is an instance of gender-based violence, if a local woman is raped by a member of the construction crew, the World Bank doesn't go after the contractor they don't try the rape. They don't try to get into that. They leave that to the local criminal authorities. Instead, what they do is they say, you failed in having an effective compliance system, and we're going to bar you from future contracting because you don't have an effective risk mitigation system in place. Those compliance systems are the gift that keeps giving. Anti-corruption, gender-based, everything. It's really important to think about that in terms of adding it to the South African law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, professors and Mr. Kitu. A warm round of applause. Professor Kino, kindly do the honors, please. While that happens and the photograph taken with the panel, the official photograph anyway, let me please call on stage the panel that is to be moderated by Dr. Moses Kanyile, Mr. Ndlovu, Retired Admiral Higgs, Mr. Tlakudi, and Mr. Mkwanazi. The panel discussion will focus on innovation in defense procurement, and I would imagine my dear brother from Stellenbosch would be especially keen to engage this. However, okay, I'm not going to spoil your shine. I think I'll give you an opportunity just to drop one or two important details about that research. Take a photo, please, gentlemen and lady, as the panel discussion is on its way up. The time is, and I think we're doing relatively well, we are doing well. Because the lunch break yesterday was an hour long, and I came out only 15 minutes into the lunch break, there were no burgers. It simply means that we can actually recover time in the lunch break because we don't do the whole wine and dine thing. It's pretty much a finger lunch setup. So we will cover time in the lunch break, please. Therefore, Dr. Kanyile, the time is now, okay, I'm going to just round it off to 12 hours 55. At 13 hours 25, that still gives you your 30-minute, as was allotted in the program. I'll be back on stage. So you can engage the Q&A and the discussion as you will see fit, but in 30 minutes from now, actually 32 minutes from now, I will be back to dismiss people for lunch so that we can start at 2 o'clock. Everybody happy with that? Sounds fair? Thank you very much. Take it away, sir.
Thank you. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Moses. My job is the easiest on the planet because I'm just asking questions. I'll ask one or two questions and the rest will come from the floor. I'm sure we'll beat the deadline of the program director. I have on stage in no particular sequence. Oh, let me start on this side. Mr. Mkwanazi, who is the former group executive from AMSCO, responsible for acquisition in the Department of Defense. The next one is retired Rear Admiral Rusty Higgs. Rear Admiral tells you all. The next one is Mr. Tlakudi, who is the former Director General in the Department of Public Enterprises. Director General in South Africa is the head of department. So the buck stops there. All right. Now, one important disclaimer is that I've invited them in their personal capacities as individuals, people who are experienced in whatever you're going to be discussing today. They are not speaking on behalf of. the departments or agencies that they come from. We just said, please come so you can just help enrich the discussions. The approach we're going to follow is very simple. It's pretty much along the lines of the local government discussion, in the sense that we want to talk about the practical things that happen in the sector from a procurement perspective. And then the rest would be coming from yourselves. Now, if I can just allow you, colleagues, a minute or two to make some opening remarks, and then we'll take it from there. Whoever wants to start. Mr. Mkonazi, do you want to do it? Okay.
Thank you. I think in the defense industry, the way we work in that environment is that what you tend to find is that the procurement, it's demand driven. We respond to the requirements of the client, which is the SNDF. That is now the acquisition agent of the SNDF, which is AMSCO. Now, AMSCO is structured such that it's got all the necessary structure and the capability to deal with the requirements of the client, which is the SNDF. The SNDF's requirements are quite unique, as you'd understand, that the environment in which they operate, their operational environment, it changes rapidly, it's highly uncertain, and also in terms of the equipment that is required, you tend to find that majority of the requirements are such that they are solutions that are not existing. Thanks to the professor in the morning who defined the part of procurement as the functional procurement, which is the major part of the acquisition of the DoD. If one has to split it in terms of the budget, it forms about 2/3 of the budget of the DoD, that part of the functional procurement, which we call acquisition. It is now the part where we do procurement, which in the private sector would call capital expenditure, where we deal with the requirements that does not exist, something that is going to be made. In some instances, you find that we have to deal with even technology that does not exist. So we've got a category where we develop technology. There's a procedure on that particular one. And then the other third part is what we call procurement, where we do procurement of the in-service support of the system that has been designed, developed, industrialized, and commissioned. And that part of the technology development also, if the technology doesn't exist, it forms its own process that we follow when we do the procurement of technology. The technology then is developed up to a certain level of readiness, which normally it will be at the level 7, that the technology is matured enough for us to use it in our acquisition process, which is the functional one. So mainly, that's how our process is structured. And also even in terms of the budget is structured along those lines of the acquisition versus the technology development, as well as the procurement. So in our environment, I would say that procurement innovation, it's driven from the client environment, where it has to offer solutions that are very innovative, because it has to deal with it being very effective, efficient, economic as well, and also operating a very, what I would call highly regulated environment, where compliance is critical as well. Not only local, but also even internationally. So there are a lot of laws that we need to comply to, local and internationally. Do you mind if I stand? Yes.
There we go. There we go. Dr. Kanyede, thanks very much indeed. And I'm most humbled to be here with this panel today. These three gentlemen have played a remarkable role over the last few years in the evolution of our broader defense community. And I feel lucky to be here. But as an Eastern Cape man, program director, I'm also Eastern Cape. And I was delighted that Songezo raised the point about rugby and the Eastern Cape. But just to let you know, we were at opposing schools. He was at Selborne and I was at Grey. And we are huge competitors. But what I take great delight in is that in the current World Cup, the previous World Cup, and also in the Lions Test, the Lions Tests, the controversial Lions Tests, the heart of South African Springbok leadership was Eastern Cape, Kolisi and Rassie, etc. Yeah. And of course, just an interesting thing, which I didn't mention to you, I wrote matric at Grey in 1975 in English, Afrikaans, and Xhosa. Just to give you an idea, the Eastern Cape's always been very progressive. But getting back to things, the reality is that the constitutional requirements of South Africa is that we need a national defense force and that the national defense force must defend and protect South Africa, period. But at the same time, that spawns things. The defense, the military is very fortunate that we are protected by Arms Corps so that the military can focus on war fighting and Arms Corps does acquisition, procurement, etc., so that the two don't get confused. And the reality is that the military in most G7 and including Sweden and BRICS countries is the primary driver of industrial excellence and innovation in the economy. If you listen to Professor Eukens with regard to his particularly insightful comments on competitive dialogue and compliance, but the broader stream of things, if you have a look at his country, the Pentagon plays a significant role in taking innovation into the country. And I argue for the same point in South Africa, and I don't think we have optimized that. And I intend just highlighting a few of the achievements of South Africa as a result of our broader defense and defense industry. Bearing in mind that some people argue that if it was not for the military, the defense industry, and the CSIR, our economy here would be largely agrarian and mining. That is it. The CSIR and the military have helped elevate the economy to become a more technologically sophisticated setup. And I'm going to quote a few points from Helmut Romer-Heitmann, who is a great writer in this regard. And I'm raising 7 points, and just take note of them because it gets you to understand that often the paradigm which is espoused is not correct. Do you know that the set-top box on or under your TV set was developed by frequency hopping radios developed in South Africa by the military? BMW and Ford and Daimler-Benz manufacture cars here with local steel because it was the G5, our big cannons. The cannon developers required such a huge improvement in the tolerances and quality of steel from then ISCOR and then later as Accelera Metal is now capable of supplying high quality body panels. Elements of the Meerkat, the SALT, the SALT, and Square Kilometer Array, the SKA, radio telescopes have been developed from radar and fire control technology first developed for anti-aircraft and armored vehicles projects. Many airliner components for Airbus, Boeing, and business jet companies draw on knowledge gained during the Rooivalk project. The Rooivalk is our attack helicopter. The leading edges, in other words, the front of the wings of all Airbus A320 aircraft were produced by a company, a local company called Aerosud, which was started by 4 of the original Rooivalk engineers. Rail brake testing equipment for the railways being used locally and internationally was developed initially by Arms Corps' Institute of Maritime Technology in Simonstown as a spin-off from Sonar Research. Many of the carbon fiber airline passenger seats and bicycles we use today are offshoots of a military satellite program. The man heading the SKA is a former Royvalk engineer. We actually need a place where we can build more South Africans of all colors, of genders, everybody to emulate that. And thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to put things there. I believe that defense is vital to the future of our country. The defense is the ultimate underpinner of our democracy. If the military did not respond properly, and I've got skin in the game, just over 2 years ago, I think we'd still be in trouble. And I just ask you all to reflect on that and to see how we can learn from other countries, as Professor Eukens so beautifully put out, on how we can make better use of what we have with a brilliant arms corps and defense industry and elevate it to its position, to its rightful position. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. As it was said, I'm Khatazzo Tlhakudi. I'm the former DG of Public Enterprises. But I do have other roles these days. I am an economic advisor at Dentons, which is the biggest law firm in the world. We have offices in over 18 countries on the continent. There's about 12,800 lawyers that are available. So if you have trouble, please call on us. We'll be happy to assist you. And I do some consulting work as well for the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. There is what is called African Renaissance Capital, which the long-term aspirations, obviously, for the foundation to be less reliant on charitable donations to ensure its independence, as it does the good work that it does on the continent in ensuring political stability, and of course, in ensuring that this continent starts to punch its weight in global economic affairs. Some of the research that Admiral Hicks spoke to from Helmut actually comes from the report that was commissioned by ourselves, or by the then ourselves, Department of Public Enterprises with PwC. He was working with PwC. And what that emphasizes, as we're talking about procurement and innovation, is the importance of the defense industry in ensuring that a country like ours, and obviously in others that sees defense procurement is important in developing the industrial base. What we know for sure today is that things are not as good as they have been for the industry. We know our industry is becoming a lot more reliant on exports for it to survive. And that can be good for this country. And it's a good thing that we have some of my former colleagues here from government present. And I just want to make the following points. What is critical if we are to ensure that the innovative products that some of Admiral Hicks has spoken to come into being is that we need to see that defense spend protected. One of the points that we made as we tried to address the issue of Denel was that you can't help Denel unless the defense spend is protected. As long as you have the defense department having to compete with social challenges in accessing funding, we are not going to win, because obviously the social challenges that we have are quite emotive. If you have to ask, the National Treasury in this case, they ask you, do we spend on defense or do we spend on building toilets in rural areas where we have had unfortunate incidents of children dying falling into pit toilets? You can't win that argument. But as a country, we need to understand that we need to invest in capability, and that capability is the industrial base that we have. The unfortunate situation that we have now is that we are seeing that capability eroding. Because if you are going to be reliant on foreign countries, of course, they also want to develop their own industrial base. And they're eyeing our intellectual property in this country. And we've been seeing what is happening. Some of our countries, of our companies are having to set up operations outside the country. And that erodes our ability as a country to realize, amongst others, that growth that we have been fighting for. And of course, with a local industrial base, as everyone would know, it gives you an ability to also tailor solutions, including engineering and obviously engineering solutions to your local conditions. Products, obviously, that have been developed here in this country, obviously are better suited, obviously, to deliver a unique environment in this particular country, especially on the continent as well, as we have seen with how, for instance, the Rifalk helicopter has performed in peacekeeping operations. I also want to just touch on the issue of, that will, and this political will, but also will from the administrative part of government, but also this will must be reflected as well from the private sector as well, because we need to invest. We need to invest in research and development. As things stand, we are not doing so well as a country. We're sitting at about 0.61% of our GDP goes towards research and development. I mean, there's a report that the Department of Science and Innovation, they commissioned, and we need to be looking to move that figure probably closer to 2 to 3% of GDP. Incidentally, that figure reflects as well how much we are spending on defense itself as a country. I think we're around 0.75%, instead of being around 2% of GDP, which is where we should be. Now, when you look at that particular figure, and this is where I want to come to the private sector, government spends, of that spend, 56% is from government related institutions. Business only spends 26.9%, contributes 26.9%. Now, government is 20% of our GDP. I mean, it's quite self-evident that there's something wrong there. We need to have the business leaders that are here. How much are we really spending in developing that pipeline of products and services going forward? Ultimately, for the benefit of our country, to create more jobs, as the figures that we saw yesterday, obviously are painting a very serious challenge for us. 13% of that spend is by foreign companies. Now, that is where, if we're talking about skills erosion, there was a large outcry when it was realized a couple of years ago how many of our defense engineers actually are in the Middle East. They are going there because they are chasing these projects, but what they are doing, they're also building up industrial capabilities in those countries. So something needs to be done, and I think as a collective here, there's some very clever people in this room. We need to find out how do we obviously pull all our efforts to address this particular challenge. Now, lastly, last week I spent a couple of days in Uganda, the Pearl of Africa. It was National Science Week. Now, the Secretariat for Science, Technology and Innovation there spends a lot of money on startups, and most of these are tech and startups, including manufacturing startups. And what they are trying to do is obviously ensure that a bigger pie of what is procured in Uganda comes from local entities. Now, for me, the energy that I saw that the president graced the event, and the president, one of the things that he did when he got there was that he said the funding for this secretariat is going to be guaranteed going forward. The Minister of Finance, incidentally, was there. And obviously, he stood up and he concurred that what the president has just announced shall happen. It shows the political will. And that's what I referred to earlier. And I think in this country, we need that. We keep putting more and more responsibility on our defense force to perform certain functions, but it's not matched by the funding that is required. So we need to address that. But for me, what was impressive being there is to see the young people. I mean, you had the last 2 days was the investor conference. Obviously, you have venture capitalists and private equity firms from all over the world that came in looking for opportunities to invest in those entities. Oh, am I chowing time? My apology. What is great about is to see these young people, I mean, in the middle of Africa, in the Pearl of Africa, developing these concepts with funding provided by their government, obviously to de-risk them so they are ready for investment by all those who are coming from the outside. We need to do similar things here. Not only, I know there's been quite good effort that has been done in the defense industry by the DoD, but we need more across the whole country. Ultimately, we need to get that 0.6% closer to 3%. My apologies for talking too long.
I don't know, can you hear me? Yeah, that's what passion does. You know, it keeps you going, it keeps you saying things, you want to say more and more and more. Now, colleagues, I realize that we really don't have a lot of time on our hands. You guys have mentioned a lot of things that are very relevant, including issues of investment, R&D investment. Just as a matter of interest, you know, in the first half of the 1990s, South Africa was averaging around 6 billion rand per year in terms of R&D investment in defense. Today, as of late 2022, we're just over 500 million and getting worse. Now, if you look at that, it's not a nice fall, it is a terrible one. I actually wanted to ask you questions about how you move things. I mean, you've already indicated the kind of innovations that South Africa has already done coming from the defense space. But I know that the audience wants to ask more questions than I do. I'd rather give you an opportunity to ask them questions as quickly as possible. And the answers, we're going to go like this and that, and that's it. All right? Because there's somebody who's going to be doing the same thing to me. Yes, ma'am, go ahead. If you don't mind, you can tell us who you are, where you're from, and who you're directing your question to. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm still Advocate Nandi Pansaluba, the person who you left the post to when you left the Defense Force. Admiral, Arms Corps and DG, you must help us. Admiral just spoke about the goodness of defense. Hence, we must all vote for defense to get more money, because we develop products in defense for military, and then they get decommercialized to civilian. Right. That's where I'm going to dock today. I want us to look at the security challenges, at human dignity, flouting challenges of some of the products that we have developed with good intentions. The satellites, for example, how now the evolution of the laws, privacy laws, have begun to challenge how they are configured. I want to say, as I'm calling for votes for us to get more money as defense, but how do you see the prototype development now as Arms Corps being configured such that next to the inventor, there is an engineer lawyer to look at the unintended consequences of this product when it moves out of the military to a civilian where the laws of the game are different. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you caught the question. We're not here to read out CVs, personal CVs. Prof. Quinn, I took liberty to invite some of the generals and senior staff members of the Department of Defense And just so that they don't have to answer all the questions, they can always defer. Yes, sir. Yes, Doc. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Ernst Heidenrich. I'm from Stellenbosch University. My question sort of combined, and anyone on the panel can answer. I'm glad that most of the panel mentioned budget. The first thing I want to ask is, in bringing budget and innovation together, we know that the SANDF is funded for its primary function, not its secondary functions. So what I want to ask is, if that is the approach we're taking to fund them for their primary function, do you find, or do any of you have an opinion as to whether that stifles innovation, in the sense that the secondary functions are not included in that model as set out under the 1996 white paper? And linked to that is, if we do not necessarily fund for secondary functions, where will we then be able to do innovation with regards to something like internal deployment? We often hear the SANDF is not geared, it doesn't have the technology, it doesn't have the equipment to be deployed internally, only externally. So if we then focus so much on the primary function, not the secondary functions, is there room still to say from the client side, let's fund for secondary functions as well?
Thank you. We're going to take one more question. If ever we do have spare time, 2 more. All right. Evidence, witnesses. He gave me 2. He said I can ask 2 more. All right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's Stellenbosch again. To the gentleman there, with the changes happening in the network industries, particularly the aerospace, which is critical for advanced manufacturing, just like defense, bringing in private ownership, like SAA 51%. It's obvious that public procurement won't be sufficient to drive industrialization if private ownership is dominant. Aerosuit, for instance, it developed at the back of public procurement, SAA buying fleet or leasing fleet, and some work packages by Airbus, Boeing to Aerosuit, Cobham to supply components. Now, with those changes, what is your view on the instruments that can be used to support industrialization in those sectors, particularly defense materials, as well as aerospace, if the role of the state is being reduced in those sectors? Thanks.
Thank you. Last question.
So I just need to make a quick contribution as well on procurement innovation, because you guys come from a strategic level. I was working at tactical level. We had a problem with the procurement of food, and our feeding system was affected terribly. We abandoned the system of public procurement, because Treasury does allow for a catering model called commercialization. It was there since 1994 that we could go onto that commercialization catering model. There isn't enough time to explain that. But what has happened, we have implemented that catering model. All it does, it allows the unit to procure the rations, we call it rations, or the raw materials. And the chefs employed by the military, they prepare this food and they put it on the table, and the soldier consumes the food. At the end of the month, the unit then submits a claim to the government, and they are compensated at 80% of the daily rate. If it is 100 rands per person per day, the state only pays 80% of that rate to the unit. And what is good with that system now, the old system, the state paid for the whole process, the raw materials, and some of the raw materials disappeared before they get processed. And the state carried the risk. With the new system, the state is now only paying for the food that was consumed by the soldier. And it is also paying at a very low rate of 80%. And what is also good, which fits in with this discussion we are having here, the unit is now buying where they are located. Now you have small farmers coming up around the unit. The unit is now becoming a serious economic player where they are located. I think a good example is in Oudtshoorn, where the food used to come from Cape Town. Now they are getting their food from Oudtshoorn and George. And everybody is happy now. The officer commanding is now taken very serious in that community. Thank you, sir.
Can you hear me now? All right. Thank you so much, because that's a very practical example, which is very much relevant to this discussion. Brief comments on all the questions. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Doctor. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. I think I can answer or respond a little bit to question 1, 2, and 3. 4, I'm not really.
It's a comment. That was a comment.
But just in brief, I think that, Advocate, thank you very much indeed for raising that issue. The military, as was very clearly explained in the Soretti Commission 13 years ago, has a unique role to play in society, because everybody in the military up front has got to be trustworthy. You stand there, and there's a code of conduct, and one of the important things in that code of conduct, which gets read out at each parade, is this. You've got to be examples. If there's corruption and you're aware of it, you don't report it, you're equally liable. The military have got a very, very tight defining role in what they should do in society. That, in addition to the youth service programs, I think are very, very good, and they're very practical. And I implore and encourage everybody in the military to be role models into society, because they are so self-disciplined. They look after themselves, they look after the community in such a way. And I believe that there's a much greater role for the military to play in our beloved country, the evolution of our country, than we are doing at the moment. We could talk for hours on this. Doctor, with regard to the issue, the primary functions, secondary functions, etc., I think a lot of that logic comes from just post-1994, where people were terrified that the military would play too big a role in society. So the military was almost scripted into a very narrow role. And that was understandable then. Since 2015 Defense Review, things have changed considerably. And of course, I think we possibly need a new review now, which would allow us to look more broadly at things. But I think that the military, the ethos of the military, the commitment, the patriotism, and everything is underutilized at this stage. I think the people themselves in service, the veterans who've still got energy, can play a significant role. And I think that we need to broaden the definition of how we do things, most definitely. What are the immediate threats to our country, particularly when we're spending virtually nothing on defense? So the issue with regard to joint ventures, I'm a great believer in joint ventures. I think that if you bring privatization and a different logic into things, that makes us very, very competitive. I think the state has a unique role to play, but the state doesn't bring in internationally competitive business logic. Private enterprise and joint ventures allow you to do that, and we can discuss that for a lot. So I'm very much in favor of going into joint ventures. I think the Pentagon is a very good example of that also. There are lots of other examples. Nothing has to be 100% state-controlled, not so ever. And the whole thing is one must bring in the competitive dimensions which only free enterprise can bring into things. Yeah, and those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the first question, my comment will be the fact that, yes, there is a need, especially to manage in that environment, the intellectual property, because whatever technology has been developed, by the defense industry, that technology belongs to the state. So there's a very important role that is required in terms of managing property rights that comes out of that. And then in terms of the primary function, which is funded by the DoD, yes, as Admiral has just stated, that there is that emphasis in terms of the primary role. But the other primary role of AMSCO as an acquisition agent of the DoD is to sustain the defense industry, so that the capability that has been built in the defense industry that is supporting the SNDF has to be sustained. So as we do that, indirectly, there are spin-offs in terms of spinning off to the private sector industry, which has also been cited by Admiral Hicks. So although there is that primary role, but in terms of sustaining the defense industry, it automatically sustains also the other industries, such as the security industry. In terms of the network, the third question there, I agree that when the entities are to work with the private sector, I have got the opportunity that I work for the private sector as well as the public sector. There are differences in terms of the procurement procedures of the private sector versus the public sector. But what I tend to find is that we need procurement professionals who clearly understand that environment, so that they are in a position to design and customize the procurement procedures for that particular environment. Your environment is similar to the environment of the parastatals like Denel. Denel, they've been finding it very difficult to operate in a procurement environment, competing with the private companies using our PFMA procedures, which are very restrictive and are not flexible. But what we experience in AMSCO is that within the framework of the government, the public procurement, one is in a position to structure, like I've mentioned earlier on, that we have structured our procurement in a different categories that deals with the requirements of that particular category, so that we are effective and efficient in doing the work. So I think that is what is important.
Yeah, I don't know if I should give Mr. Klauti a chance, but it should not exceed 30 seconds. Is that okay, sir? 30 seconds.
29 and counting.
Yeah, I think I said quite a bit earlier on. The only thing I want to say on the issue of primary and secondary responsibilities funding is that I think the political ambiguity towards defense needs to change, and Admiral Hicks has spoken to it. This is an essential capability of a sovereign state, and all of us should be outraged. We have seen the stories that have been covered by News 24 recently in terms of the state of our defense force. That cannot be. This country, if intends to play its rightful role on the continent, we need to ensure that our defense is properly funded. And of course, we know the trickle effects to the rest of the economy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, colleagues. What my colleagues have just done, they've basically introduced to you some of the salient points that all of us should take back to our communities, to our environments, to our organizations. Any country that wants to develop economically has to invest in the skills in terms of technology, this and that and that and that. Defense is on the apex side of things when it comes to high tech. When you go around the country and look at what is happening in terms of science, technology, and engineering and all of those things, they aspire to be part of defense. Now, the erosion of budget as things stand today does not augur well for the country's future development in terms of its industrial base and so on. At some point, South Africa had 1 in 10 engineers in the country were in defense. All right. Now, today, it's a different situation altogether. And it's something that we, all of us, have to do something about it. But other than that, thank you so much to my wonderful panel. I really appreciate it.
Professor Kino will do the honors. Talking about defense budget, the United States, as a percentage to GDP, has 3.5% of defense budget, which totals 1.80 trillion US dollars. It stands to reason, therefore, why you would have these technological advances in the US, Facebook, YouTube, Yahoo, all these things that are about innovation. There's a relationship. There certainly is a relationship with US spending or the US defense budget to the technological advances it continues to make. And I mean, can you imagine Google and how useful that is to the United States? Dr. Kanyile, job well done. It certainly was not easy, that much I know, and thank you so much for honoring time. And because of that, he has earned you all an extra 10 minutes, so we meet at 14:10. Now, nobody's allowed to move until I get to the door because I know what you guys do best.